Here is a novel that will forever be considered a triumph of the imagination. Set on the desert planet Arrakis, Dune is the story of the boy Paul Atreides, who would become the mysterious man known as Muad'Dib. He would avenge the traitorous plot against his noble family, and would bring to fruition humankind's most ancient and unattainable dream. A stunning blend of adventure and mysticism, environmentalism and politics, Dune won the first Nebula Award, shared the Hugo Award, and formed the basis of what is undoubtedly the grandest epic in science fiction. Since its publication in 1965, Dune has been revered by its fans. They fell in love with House Atreides and the young protagonist Paul. They fell in love with the mysterious nomads, the Fremen. They fell in love with the spice and its enormous guardians, the sandworms. But most of all, I think they fell in love with planet Arrakis as a whole. Dune is a romantic tale of the good Atreides versus their evil rivals, the Harkonnens. But it is also a very intelligent story with so much more to it than that. Just like the desert of Arrakis, Frank Herbert's Dune has riches hidden beneath the surface. Several consistent themes and thematic messages can be found in Dune, and I think for Frank Herbert these messages are what Dune is really all about. So, what is Dune really all about? Well, Dune is a critique of religion, it is a critique of mythology and mysticism, and it is about resource scarcity and the impact that has on our politics. It is also about ecology and how we, as humans, tend to think of ourselves as separate from the ecosystem that we live in. If one zooms out, Dune really has two big thematic threads. The first, being the most obvious, is the theme of ecology, as it becomes the scientific lens in which we understand Arrakis and the politics that have developed there. Frank Herbert was an environmentalist, and he wanted us to look at the world as an ecosystem. Dune doesn't have robots or space battles or any of these traditional tropes that often finds themselves in science fiction. Instead, the science in this science fiction novel is looking at the planet and society as ecosystems, each shaping and influencing the other. And from this springs the topic of today's video, which is the second big theme, the theme of the charismatic leader. Or rather, Frank Herbert's warning against the societal danger of charismatic leaders. In this video, I would like to present my thoughts on how Frank Herbert delivers this message through the protagonist Paul. Paul is but a 15-year-old boy at the start of the story, and the Emperor has just granted his father, Duke Leto, rulership of the desert planet Arrakis, otherwise known as Dune. Arrakis was previously ruled by the Atreides' arch-enemy Baron Harkonnen, and so House Atreides suspect that Arrakis might be a trap. It is, however, not all bad, as this dry desert planet is the only place in the universe, a priceless substance that allows for space travel among other things. So the spice can in many ways be thought of as a sort of metaphor for modern-day oil. Baron Harkonnen wants his planet back, and so the Atreides are right in suspecting a trap. The Baron has in secret plotted with the Emperor to get rid of House Atreides, and not long after their arrival on Arrakis, Harkonnen and Imperial troops invade the planet. Duke Leto is killed and Arrakis is lost, but Paul and his mother manage to flee into the desert, where they join forces with the desert people, the Fremen. Paul becomes a religious icon to the Fremen, the prophet Paul Muad'Dib, and they become his believers and worshippers. Paul leads the Fremen against the Emperor and Baron Harkonnen, and in their defeat, he finds justice for the death of his father, Duke Leto. Paul then goes on to seat himself as the new Emperor of the universe, with thunderous applause. The general plot of Dune is as old as human storytelling itself. This story at its core is the much more familiar story of a young man who loses his father, family or home, and must venture on a journey to face his deep-seated fears. Here he undergoes a metamorphosis and overcomes weaknesses, so that he can emerge reborn and make right what was wrong. It is the story of loss, adventure, and reconquest, or alternatively departure, initiation, and return. Joseph Campbell calls this journey of departure, initiation, and return the hero's journey, in his book The Hero with 1,000 Faces. The point that Joseph Campbell makes in his book is that underneath every enduring story, no matter where or when they're written, are at the core the same, with of course some smaller differences. Dune and the hero's journey are the archetypal hero story. They're in many ways the same as Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, Disney's The Lion King, Shakespeare's Hamlet, or even back to the story of Moses, and further back parts of the Epic of Gilgamesh. All of these stories are stories about the hero's journey. In The Lion King, Simba believes that he is responsible for his father's death, and so he flees into the wild. He befriends Timon and Pumbaa, who teaches him how to deal with his loss. When the lioness Nala finds Simba, he learns how bad the Pride Lands have become after he left. Simba then returns to set things right. Similarly, Moses is an Israelite orphan who grows up with the royal family of Egypt. One day Moses kills a slave master who was hurting a Hebrew, and afterwards he flees into the wilds. Here God reveals himself to Moses and commands him to return to Egypt and free the Israelites from slavery and bring them to the Holy Land. Moses returns and confronts the Pharaoh, and only after 10 plagues does he agree with Moses' demands. I think Frank Herbert paid close attention to the hero's journey when he wrote Dune, and more specifically when he created Paul. I think Paul can be seen as the archetypal hero, but why does it matter, you may ask? Why should it matter that Paul's journey is the hero's journey, if it is so common in literature? The answer to that is that it matters because Frank Herbert goes out of his way to make Paul this classical hero, the vanquisher of evil and the savior of the downtrodden. It matters because, in the subtext of Dune, underneath this tale of heroism, plays out an entirely different story. In the subtext of Dune is a story that doesn't praise heroes at all, but instead offers a stern warning against believing in heroes. Or as Frank Herbert puts it, a warning against blindly following charismatic leaders. Frank Herbert was concerned with how willing people were to follow leaders blindly, and one can imagine why, as the world had just gone through the rise of Hitler a little over 2 decades prior to Dune's publication. However, his criticism of leaders wasn't just aimed at figures like Hitler. It was aimed at anyone who could inspire people to stop thinking critically, figures such as President Kennedy. He believed that people stopped questioning these charismatic leaders, and that carried with it an inherent extreme danger. Frank Herbert's belief was that every human makes mistakes, and mistakes made by charismatic leaders are amplified by the number of people who are blindly following them. So when Frank Herbert creates the perfect hero in Paul, the perfect leader who inspires loyalty and overcomes injustices, he does not do so because he wants to sing Paul's praises. On the contrary, he makes Paul a hero so he can dismantle our love of heroes. Frank Herbert's Dune is a disillusionment with the hero's journey. Part of the Dune plot can be boiled down to the struggle of good versus evil. On the good end of the spectrum you have the Atreides family and the Fremen, and on the evil end you have Baron Harkonnen and the Emperor. Baron Harkonnen and the Emperor are both tyrannical, and we never get to see them in a sort of positive light. The Emperor represents tyranny through strength. He keeps the Emperor in line through fear and intimidation, and one of the places we get a glimpse of that is in the beginning of the book when he orders Duke Leto to move to Arrakis. From Leto's perspective, he either has to comply or take the family atomics and go rogue. In other words, he would have to flee. The Emperor is that scary. Everyone fears him, on one hand because of his personality, and on the other hand because of his elite soldiers, the Sardaukar, who are regarded as the strongest and most disciplined soldiers in the universe. It seems to me that the Emperor is very much the type of leader that we find in the Animal Kingdom, where the strongest rule, or as the saying goes, might makes right. This is how Dune presents the Emperor, even down to his appearance, where he's described as having that same look of the predatory bird. Baron Harkonnen is the second tyrannical leader of the book. Unlike the Emperor, he does not rule through fear or intimidation, but instead he rules through pleasure and desire. Just like the Emperor, Baron Harkonnen is the physical embodiment of his unique style of leadership. Harkonnen is a hedonist, a constantly self-indulging fat man, so fat that in order to move about he has to be supported by advanced equipment. He's the type of leader that gives us what we desire for, but the downside to this coin is that our desires end up ruling us. We see many times in the book how the Baron knows people's deepest desires, and he takes advantage of that. In this light, it's really not a surprise that we find him as the ruler of Arrakis, the home of the spice which is so addictive, and the whole universe depends on it to function. There are examples in the book of how the Baron controls people through their desires. His captain of the guard, for instance, is a notorious drug addict, and for this reason Baron is so pleased with him. If the captain does something the Baron does not like, well, he can just withhold the drug and effectively control him this way. The Baron also convinces Dr. Yue that he has captured Dr. Yue's wife, and so by playing on Dr. Yue's deep desire to be reunited with his wife, he convinces Yue to betray Duke Leto. The last example I want to bring up is how the Baron manipulates the Emperor. The Emperor wants to be unchallenged in his rule. His desire is to be that top dog of the universe. But Duke Leto's popularity is growing, and this is threatening the Emperor. Knowing this, the Baron convinces the Emperor to join the plot to get rid of this troublesome Duke. The Emperor and the Baron are clearly portrayed in a very negative light. They are the baddies all the way through. There can be little doubt about that when reading Dune. But while they're the antagonists of the story, they are not the figures that Frank Herbert warns us about. After all, he warns us about the charismatic leaders, the ones we don't realize how bad they are. So, ironically, Frank Herbert warns us about the heroes of the story. He warns us about the Atreides family. The Atreides rule through love, loyalty, and propaganda. They are the heroes. Even their family name, the Atreides, allude to this fact. They claim descent from Agamemnon, son of Atreus, the hero king of ancient Greek mythology, which can either be taken at face value or the much more likely version that this is another piece of Atreides propaganda. For generations, the Bene Gesserit, the secretive witches of the universe, have been running a breeding program in the attempts to produce the Kwisatz Haderach, the perfect leader who can guide humanity to the brightest future. Paul is a result of this breeding program. This is why he has the ability to see the future. Paul is suspected of being this Kwisatz Haderach, and for generations the Bene Gesserit have slowly planted a belief all over the universe that one day a savior with his abilities will come and guide people to a better future. This belief has been planted everywhere, even among the desert nomad the Fremen, and this is why they view Paul as a messiah. And they're not wrong to view Paul this way. He has so many things going for him. He's a charismatic Atreides who win people over with love, and he can see into the future and be able to avoid the mistakes that ordinary human would inevitably make. So in many ways Paul is the ideal leader, the perfect hero who could right every wrong in the universe. Yet for all Paul's strengths, he feels powerless to stop what he calls the jihad. The jihad that he foresees is that in his victory, a devastating war will be unleashed upon the universe by the Fremen. In his name, terror and devastation will follow, and Paul desperately tries to find a way to prevent this from happening. Paul explores several future paths that could prevent this, but none of them can. Even his own death and failure seemingly cannot stop the jihad, even though it will be done in his name. The Fremen are too in love with the image of Paul the Messiah, and his death would just be interpreted as a martyr's death, and his actions rewritten into a mythological narrative which supports the Fremen's understanding of what he's meant to bring them. The sad truth comes to Paul during the story that the legends surrounding him are just bigger than he is. There is however one path forward which could prevent the jihad and bring peace to the universe, but Paul is unwilling to walk it. This path is named the Golden Path, a political direction that will yield peace for thousands of years. so you might wonder why Paul does not want to do this. I mean, after all, millennia of peace sounds pretty good, right? But in the Golden Path, Paul would stop people in doing what they want to do. He would be shutting down people's freedoms whenever they veered off the Golden Path. And so, in effect, he would have to become a tyrant, hated by all. And this is a very ironic twist on the story, where in order to truly become the hero that Fremen see him as, he would have to become the most despised one of all. And in short, he would have to become everything that is the direct antithesis of what the Atreides stand for. So ultimately in the book, Paul has two choices. Either he can walk the path of tyranny and bring peace to the universe, or he can walk the path of the charismatic leader and be beloved by all, and doom everyone to war and destruction through the jihad. Despite his victory over the Emperor on Harkonnen, Paul has a lose-lose situation on his hands. In the end though, he walks the path of the charismatic leader, which always results in misery. This is foreshadowed in the book through Paul's grandfather who dies bullfighting to impress the crowd, and is also foreshadowed by Paul's father Duke Leto, who accepts Arrakis to impress those that follow Atreides, but this ultimately also spelled out badly for both the Duke and the many that believed in him. The dilemma that Frank Herbert has Paul face is surprisingly pessimistic. There is no choice he can make which is good. As the legends surrounding Paul are bigger than he is, the only way to really prevent the jihad would be if people did not follow charismatic leaders blindly and believing in them without question. And so Paul becomes the embodiment of Frank Herbert's warning that when leaders make mistakes, their mistakes are amplified by the number of people who follow them without question. The jihad is this message taken to an extreme. In the following Dune book, the concept of the Golden Path is further explored. Here Paul is losing his heroic aura, and his son Leto II decides to follow the Golden Path his father refused. Leto II becomes the tyrant, known as the God Emperor of Dune. Interestingly enough, Paul's son, the God Emperor of Dune, rules with a mix of brutal strength and harsh spice control, withholding spice from anyone who steps out of line. So Leto II, the God Emperor of Dune, takes on the central tyrannical characteristics of both the Old Emperor and Baron Harkonnen. When the later books came out, many people disliked them, because they had grown to love the hero Paul, and suddenly he was being turned towards the grey area of morality, almost into a villainous character. They didn't like this at all. These people obviously didn't catch what Frank Herbert tried to say in the subtext of this story, but they were right. Paul was the hero, and that was the problem. Every chapter in Dune starts out with a quote, and as we wrap up this video, I want to read out loud the quote that I think in many ways captures the essence of Dune rather beautifully. He was warrior and mystic, ogre and saint, the fox and the innocent, chivalrous, ruthless, less than a god, more than a man. From Arrakis Awakening by Princess Irulan.